Well, I've got another Morini 350 engine up on the bench, and I'm afraid the lighting conditions aren't great. I've got the sunlight streaming in from behind, so the contrast doesn't look too good. But this engine has a gearbox problem, jumping out of second gear and actually shifting into second gear as well, I believe. So I was starting to strip it down, remove the ancillaries, and of course I've got to remove the clutch side outer casing. And so what we discovered when we went to do so was that the clutch studs have come loose, which is a bit of a pain. So that's an additional repair that will have to be done, is to get a set of studs secure again. So this is a warning to other people, really. When you're screwing down the nuts, don't tighten them against the shoulder on the stud. I usually go down until they touch and then back off a quarter turn, and do put a little bit of something on the studs to stop them seizing. Otherwise this is the sort of problem you end up with. There was some small evidence of some oil in here, so we might have to look at the seals as well, but that'll be to find out once we've got everything apart. Some points to note: this is from, I think, a 74 Strada. There's no casting type on the crankcase. There's usually a letter here designating what the cases were intended for. A K or whatever, or an A for the earlier bikes, I believe it was. There's a little bit of something left there. I can't tell if it's been ground away or was never there. There is an S on the cases, which would which normally designates it being a sport engine. So when we're inside, we'll see if there's a sport cam and high compression pistons or not. These are the early style rocker boxes, which have got chamfered corners, and these have been then relatively crudely cut away to give additional clearances, because it's got the stubs for the rubber type inlet manifolds. So once I've got the clutch side case across, I can mount the whole plot up in my my engine stand, and heads and barrels will come off, and then I can split the cases. Well, this is something you never really want to see, which is silicon sealant all over the place where it shouldn't be. It looks like the oil in the clutch, which isn't a lot, but there is some, is coming past the clutch bush, which the manual suggests sealing to the shaft with blue Hylamar, which is what I've always done and never had a problem. Looks like someone's used silicon and it's all oozed out and hasn't done the job that it's supposed to. So I'm continuing to strip this engine down, taking the heads and barrels off and then wrapping the pistons up to protect them. Taking off the rear valve gear, I had 3 rocker studs unscrew from the head, and this is probably because these 3 holes have been helicoiled, and if I put them back in as they are, I'll probably Loctite them. But it gave me an opportunity to show some differences between early and late engines, and this engine is going to be a little bit of an enigma. But here on the bottom we've got an early rocker gear stud, and above it the late type, and this is M7 both ends, and the later type is M7 and M8 where it screws into the head, which also gives you a slightly coarser thread, and you can see the difference between the early and late push rods. The late push rods are thicker in the centre, and then the ends aren't pushed all the way home, which is what gives you that little bit of protection against valve to piston potential contact from a broken cam belt. Now the other thing I noticed was that at least two of the rocker studs are homemade, and they appear to have been made from a rolled fastener. The threads on one end feel nice, and on the other end they feel all torn up and gritty, so they've been cut with a die. This one I think actually might be, yeah, this is one that feels particularly horrible, and you can see this thread has got black oxide, as has the shank. This end is more silver where it's been cut, and it does feel horrible. This one I think has just had some grit in the thread that's torn it up when it was installed in something at one stage. I'm not sure that's a Morini stud as such. I think it's a stud that's been repurposed. So I'll have to decide when putting this back together whether we source some more good 7mm studs, or whether I redo the thread repairs and enlarge to 8mm to use the later studs. Now, going to the engine itself, the this journal surface here, which is where the oil seal for the crankshaft feed runs, that has got a little bit of corrosion on it, and it was a little bit rough. It's I've given it a good wipe down, and it's feeling a little better. And I expect it's not got a wear groove or anything, so I think some very careful cleaning up, and that should be fine. And this is a later style oil pump drive retaining nut. So the early ones were a hex, and this is a bearing retainer style nut, which is a special fine thread, but you can actually see torn metal where perhaps not the best fitting tool was used to fit it, and there's almost no backlash on the oil pump gears. You're meant to just tweak the pump slightly on its mounting screws to gain a little bit of clearance, and that's got practically none. Looking at this side of the engine, we're presented with a bit of a puzzle, and that's because of the presence of these three screw heads surrounding the bearing. And these would normally be a cap head where present, and if it's an early engine they wouldn't be here at all, because the engine would have a ball race on this side rather than the later plain bearing. But then again, this appears to be a sleeve on the crank, not one piece with the crank, which suggests that it is a bearing in a race, possibly for a roller bearing conversion. So these are not early style crankcases, whereas a lot of the other features we've seen with the engine are early. So we've got the right hand side case off, which is as far as we need to go for this investigation. And if we look at the case down here, you can clearly see it's a ball race on the timing side. So this is a later set of crankcases that have been used on this engine. The gearbox output bearing, I don't know if this will get picked up on the microphone. That's pretty graunchy. And the reason that's pretty graunchy is if you can see the ends of the dogs. And if I remove second gear carefully, there's 2 shims and a bronze bush. So I'm going to take it all off together. If we look at the back of the gear, you can see where the dogs have been rubbing. You can see the scored surface of the dogs. Let's see if I can zoom in a bit. And if we look at the dogs from the side, particularly on this face, they're no longer square, or even as they should be, slightly undercut. So I think we found the reason for the jumping out of gear, or at least half the reason. You know, why is this wear there? I'm just wondering whether there's a, and I'll have to check the parts diagrams, whether a shim has been left off on the other end of this shaft, because playing with the selector drum, these dogs were not fully engaging with the gear, and I'm just wondering if the whole cluster is sitting slightly too deep into the cases because the dog's missing. But you can see the little metal particles hanging around in that gear. So we'll have to work out what we're going to do to get that fixed. What else did I notice? The later style rods and rod bolts. So they've got the stud and the nut rather than the bolt. And that the early style tappets have got an oil hole. I don't know if you're going to pick... Oh yeah, you can pick up that is all the way through. Now that I've blown the oil out, there's really minimal wear on them. But I was looking for that hole because I just noticed on the cam lobes that there's this little dot on the peak, and that's obviously caused by the that little hole, and also the wear pattern on the flank. It also corresponds with the hole, but again the cam is in fine condition like they usually are. But I think we've got another bearing that's not as good as it should be. So all in all, not a disaster, but definitely stuff to look at.